He ruled an empire for 400 years, betrayed by 4 wives who wanted his throne more than they ever wanted him. He died. Then he died again. And again, so many times he stopped counting and started rating the experiences instead. Now after 9,999 years, he's been reborn as a 12-year-old kid, face down, in ash. Welcome to the Fourth Cinder Basin, a wasteland where it hasn't rained in 6 years, and the sky itself looks like it gave up. 40,000 people, one well, bone dry, and 14 different religions, all blaming each other for it. Then, a pillar of light drops out of the sky with all the enthusiasm of a game show host. This is God of the Wasteworld, and his first day on the job is about to go catastrophically wrong.
Kael Voss had been alive for approximately 11 minutes and already regretted everything. Not the dying part. Dying, as far as he could remember across 9,999 years of accumulated memory, was mostly fine. Out, he said, in a voice several octaves higher than he remembered having. That's new. He sat up. The sky above him was the burnt orange of a candle flame seen through smoke, and it didn't move, didn't shift, didn't do any of the things skies were supposed to do. It just sat there, smoldering, like it had given up on weather as a concept. A pillar of light dropped out of that sky and speared into the ash 6 feet away with the enthusiastic subtlety of a game show entrance. Congratulations, the light said, in the tone of a man who had said this exact word into this exact microphone 11,000 times that week. You have been selected for divine candidacy in the Fourth Cinder Basin, Provisional World Shell 7 Delta, also known colloquially as a pause, the particular pause of someone checking a clipboard they resent, the Wasteworld. Please hold for your orientation packet. Kael, who had once ruled an empire of glass and grief for 400 years, who had once forgotten his own name for 2 centuries just to see what it felt like, who had died so many times he'd started rating the experiences, looked at the pillar of light with the flat, unimpressed stare of a man reviewing a parking ticket. I didn't apply for this. No one applies, said the light, sounding almost sympathetic. You were nominated. By who? By the previous god of this world, in his exit interview, under the section marked, any other comments. A rustle, the sound of paper that had no business existing inside a beam of light. He wrote, and I quote, send someone who's seen worse, because this place is a real mess and I am extremely done. Then he left a forwarding address that turned out to be fake. Wonderful. Your orientation packet. The light dimmed, thickened, and folded itself into the shape of a clipboard, which dropped into Kael's lap with a papery thwap. It was, in fact, a clipboard. Bureaucracy, he noted, apparently survived the heat death of every system he'd ever lived under. 9,000 years and it was still clipboards. He read, Fourth Cinder Basin, World Shell 7 Delta Status Report. Population, 40,000, declining. Rainfall, none on record. Soil viability, ash, mostly. Some regret. Current deities, none. See, exit interview, previous incumbent. Local religions, 14, all mutually exclusive, all currently blaming each other for the rain thing. Notable hazards. Sunfall zones, see appendix. The chalk plague, see appendix. A border dispute over a well that has been dry for 6 years, see appendix, then weep. Kael flipped through 4 appendices, felt something in his ancient, tired, borrowed soul crack slightly, and set the clipboard down. So let me get this straight, he said. You want me, a 12-year-old, currently, cosmetically, to walk into a dying world with 14 warring religions, no rain, and a well that people are apparently ready to die over despite it being empty, and become their god. Correct. Do I get powers? You get potential. The light said this the way a landlord says character about an apartment with no working outlets. Divinity in Shell 7 Delta is earned, not granted. You start as a candidate. Belief is currency. You'll need worshippers before you get so much as a decent thunderclap. And if I don't want the job? A long pause. The pillar of light flickered, the cosmic equivalent of a man loosening his collar. Technically you can decline. The paperwork takes about 200 years to process, during which time you'll experience the Wasteworld as a regular, powerless, quite mortal 12-year-old, subject to all of the aforementioned hazards, with none of the aforementioned potential. Kael considered this for exactly as long as it took to remember that he had, in 9 millennia, been eaten by exactly 1 shark, betrayed by exactly 4 wives, and set on fire by his own subjects on no fewer than 3 separate and unrelated occasions. He had a very high tolerance for bad odds. He had a very low tolerance for paperwork that took 200 years to file. Fine, he said. God it is. Where do I start? That's the spirit. The light brightened, unreasonably chipper. Your starter bundle should be arriving any moment. It typically includes 1-1 Divine Spark, Dormant, 1-1 Minor Blessing of the candidate's choosing, capped at Tier 1, and a location beacon guiding you to the nearest settlement, where you may begin the process of faith acquisition. And if the starter bundle doesn't arrive, then you're just a kid in the ash, the light said, and I genuinely wish you luck, because the sun comes up in about 40 minutes and it is not a gentle sun. The pillar of light popped out of existence with the sound of a cork leaving a bottle, leaving Kael alone in a world the color of a dying campfire, holding a clipboard that smelled faintly of ozone and bad decisions. He looked down at his hands. Small, soft, 12 years old, no calluses, no scars, no history except the borrowed, 10,000-year kind rattling around behind his eyes like a library that had been dropped down a flight of stairs. Somewhere in there was the memory of how to purify water using nothing but sand and patience. Somewhere in there was the memory of 41 different languages, none of which anyone here would speak. Somewhere in there was the exact, precise knowledge of how empires fell, usually because some god, somewhere, had gotten bored. He was not going to get bored. He'd done bored. Bored god you worshipped as a plague deity for 6 centuries by accident. A second, smaller pillar of light, more of a beam, really, apologetic in size, dropped into the ash beside him and resolved into a small leather satchel. Kael opened it. Inside, a water skin, 3/4 empty. A knife with a chip in the blade. A scrap of parchment that, when he touched it, unspooled a warm, directionless pull toward the northeast, like a compass made of longing. And, at the bottom, a single flickering ember that wasn't quite fire, sitting in a small stone bowl, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. The divine spark, he thought. Dormant. Terrific. He stood, brushed ash off knees that had never before this morning known what it was to skin themselves on rock, and slung the satchel over one shoulder. Right, he said, to no one, to the smoldering orange sky, to the 9,999 years of dead ends and small victories currently doing their best to fit inside a preteen skull. 40,000 people, 14 religions, no rain, one empty well everyone's ready to die for. He started walking northeast, toward the pull in the parchment, toward the first sunrise of a life he had not asked for and fully intended to win anyway. I've built empires out of less, he muttered. I've built empires out of worse. At least this time nobody's going to make me marry a well. Behind him, the sun began to rise, and it was, exactly as promised, not a gentle sun. By the time the sun finished rising, which took a full, punishing hour of turning the sky from smoldering orange to an aggressive, personal attack white, Kael had already revised his opinion of the Wasteworld 3 times. Revision 1. It was flat, which was good, because flat meant he could see trouble coming. Revision 2. It was hot, in a way that made, not a gentle sun, feel like criminal understatement. The ash under his bare feet had gone from cool morning gray to something that made him hop-walk like an idiot for a solid 10 minutes before his borrowed, sturdy little body adjusted. Revision 3, the important one. It was not, in fact, empty. There was smoke on the horizon. Not wildfire smoke, cooking fire smoke, the good kind, and where there was cooking fire, there were people, and where there were people, there was a chance to stop being a lone 12-year-old dying picturesquely in a wasteland. He followed the parchment's warm tug toward the smoke for another hour, chewing on a strip of dried something from the satchel that he decided not to ask questions about, and arrived at the edge of a settlement that had clearly been built by people with a very complicated relationship to hope. It was a town wall made of nothing. No wall at all, just a ring of standing stones each carved with a different symbol, none of them agreeing with each other, planted in the ash like someone had tried to build a fence out of arguments. Beyond the stones sat perhaps 200 low mud brick houses, a scatter of tents, and, at the exact dead center of the settlement, an honest-to-nothing crowd of maybe 60 people, shouting. Kael had walked into a great many riots in 9,000 years. He recognized the shape of one immediately. Too many raised hands, too many people talking over each other, and at the center of it, doing the thing that always sat at the center of these things, a hole in the ground. Specifically, a well. He picked his way through the standing stones. Nobody stopped him, nobody so much as glanced at a small ash-smudged child walking into their apocalypse, and got close enough to hear. Because the ledger keeper specifically forbids drawing water on the 3rd day of the counting, and if the Sunmothers think they can just. The Sunmothers haven't drawn water from that well in 6 years because there's no water in the well, you absolute. That is not the point, Talon, the point is jurisdiction. There is no water to have jurisdiction over. Kael stood at the edge of the crowd for a while, watching. 2 factions, maybe more folded in at the edges. He counted at least 4 distinct banner colors and a truly startling number of hand-painted holy symbols. Arguing with the specific, exhausted fury of people who had been having this exact argument for years and had simply run out of new things to say, so they were saying the old things louder. The well itself, when he finally got a look at it between shoulders, was a stone ring maybe 4 feet across, bone dry, its rope frayed to threads, a single dented bucket sitting at the bottom like a monument to disappointment. 40,000 people, 14 religions, no rain, he thought. Well, at least the file wasn't lying about the well part. He was still deciding how to insert a 12-year-old body into a theological property dispute without getting trampled when someone grabbed his sleeve. "You're new," said the someone. Kael turned. The someone was a girl, roughly his own body's age, with cropped hair the color of the ash outside and an expression of profound, professional suspicion. She had a sling tucked into her belt, a satchel not unlike his own slung crosswise over her chest, and the specific posture of a kid who had appointed herself the settlement's unofficial problem. I'm new, Kael agreed. Nobody's new. Nobody comes in. People leave. She looked him up and down, taking in the soot, the satchel, the general, freshly hatched, quality of someone who had been alive for under a day. Sunfall Zone spit you out. Something like that, huh? She did not seem especially moved by this. You got food. Some. You got water. Little. You got a god. Kael blinked. Quote. Come again. A god. She said it the way you'd ask someone if they had a coat, mildly, checking off a list. Everybody who walks in out of the ash either belongs to one of the 14 already, or they're shopping for one, or, she narrowed her eyes slightly, they're one, which happens maybe twice a decade and usually goes badly for everyone involved, so I'm going to go ahead and hope you're just shopping. Define badly. Last one melted a grain silo trying to make it rain and then left. We're still eating the memory of that harvest. She stuck out a hand, entirely business. I run messages, I know where the actual water is versus the water everyone's pretending is there. And I do not, under any circumstances, get involved in the argument currently happening 11 feet from us. You want to survive the basin, you stick close to someone who already knows how. That's me. 10% finder's fee on anything I help you get. Kael shook her hand. Small, calloused, grip firm enough to mean business. He decided, in the specific and immediate way he'd once decided whether an advisor could be trusted with a treasury, that he liked her. Kael, he said, She jerked her chin toward the crowd. That's the third well dispute, by the way. Not the first. Not going to be the last. The ledger keepers think the well's dry because the Sunmothers offended the counting calendar. The Sunmothers think it's dry because the ledger keepers dug it on unconsecrated ash. Everybody else thinks it's dry because it hasn't rained in 6 years, but nobody's willing to say that part loudly because the sky just stopped isn't a very satisfying thing to build a religion around. It hasn't rained anywhere, in the whole basin, not since the last god left. Ress said this flatly, without drama, the way you'd mention a shop had closed. Some people think that's why. Sky doesn't rain without a god to ask it nicely. Other people think that's superstitious garbage and the truth is just bad luck stacked 14 religions high. She shrugged. Doesn't much matter what caused it. Matters that the well's dry and the third district's about 40 minutes from someone throwing the first punch. Kael looked past her at the shouting crowd, at the bone-dry well, at the standing stones with their contradictory carvings, at the whole ridiculous, cobbled, human mess of it, and felt something shift behind his ribs that had nothing to do with borrowed memory and everything to do with instinct 9,000 years deep. He'd fixed worse than this. He'd fixed worse than this by accident, usually right before making it catastrophically worse in some other direction, but still. He knew the shape of a solvable problem when he saw one, and an empty hole in the ground that everyone had decided was sacred instead of just empty was, if nothing else, extremely solvable. The satchel at his hip felt suddenly warmer. He glanced down. Through the leather, faint and patient, the ember in its stone bowl was glowing very slightly brighter than it had a minute ago. Oh, he thought, you're going to make me do the well thing, aren't you? He said slowly, how do you feel about helping a shopping for a god newcomer make some very specific trouble? Ress looked at him for a long moment, the specific, evaluating look of someone doing quiet math on whether a stranger was an opportunity or a liability, and then, apparently, the math came out in his favor, because she grinned in a way that suggested she'd been bored for a very long time and had just found something interesting. Depends, she said. Does trouble come with the 10% or extra? Extra, Kael said. Definitely extra. Then I feel great about it. She turned on her heel, already walking toward the well, already shouting something at the crowd about making room, and Kael, 12 years old, 9,999 years deep, one dormant divine spark and a chipped knife to his name, followed her in. Behind them, unnoticed by everyone but him, the sky over the Fourth Cinder Basin held its same static, rainless orange. Not for long, Kael thought, and went to go argue with a well. Getting 60 shouting adults to notice a 12-year-old is, as a rule, nearly impossible. Getting them to notice a 12-year-old holding a knife over a sacred well, however, turns out to take about 4 seconds. Hey, Kael hadn't meant to shout it quite that loud. Something about having a body with smaller lungs and higher-pitched vocal cords meant everything came out sounding more urgent than intended, but it worked. The argument stuttered, 60 heads turned, and for one blessed moment the third well dispute went completely silent except for the wind hissing through the standing stones. I'm going to fix your well, Kael announced, into that silence, with the calm, over-rehearsed confidence of a man who had opened exactly this kind of speech roughly 400 times across 9 millennia. And then you're all going to stop hitting each other about it. A ledger-keeper in blue-gray robes, an older man with a truly heroic amount of chalk dust in his beard, found his voice first. This well has been dry for 6 years. Whole processions of holy men have prayed over that hole. You're going to fix it. Yes, with what? Knowledge, Kael said, and a bucket. This got him laughed at, which he'd expected, and also several dozen further seconds of uninterrupted argument silence, which he'd also expected, because nothing shuts up a crowd of angry adults faster than a child saying something confidently insane. Ress, beside him, had the particular look of someone watching a bet she hadn't placed yet start paying off anyway. Give him room, she barked, in a voice with far more authority than her 12-year-old frame had any right to produce, and this was the part that mattered, this was the part Kael filed away carefully, they did. The crowd shuffled backward. Ress clearly had more standing in this settlement than kid who runs messages implied. Kael crouched at the well's edge and looked down into the dry shaft. 4 feet across, stone-lined, going down maybe 30 feet before the light gave out. He'd expected a hole punched straight into dead rock. What he saw instead, and this was the useful part, the part 9,000 years of watching civilizations dig, drain, and ruin their own water tables had trained him to notice immediately, was damp stone about 2/3 of the way down, where the lining had cracked. Not dry, blocked. Someone's Sunmother patron sealed this well on purpose, he said, to the well, mostly, though the crowd heard it too. Or something did. There's water down there, it's just not getting up here. The Sunmother faction erupted immediately, which he'd also expected, because, your god did this deliberately, is not a sentence any religion takes calmly. The Sunmothers do not seal wells, the Sunmothers are a faith of illumination. I didn't say it was intentional, Kael said, raising his voice just enough to cut back through. I said something sealed it. 6 years ago. Anybody remember what happened here 6 years ago? Silence. Real silence this time, the kind that meant people were actually thinking instead of shouting, which Kael considered the single most useful sound in the world. An old woman near the front. No banner, no faction colors, just a patched shawl and the specific tiredness of someone who'd outlived several religious movements, cleared her throat. The quake, she said. 6 years back, ground shook for half a day. Cracked 3 houses on Miller's Row. She squinted at the well. Never thought about the well. There it is, Kael said, and stood up, brushing ash off his knees with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just watched an entire theological crisis reveal itself to be a plumbing problem. Your well didn't go dry because a calendar got insulted or because somebody dug on the wrong ash. It went dry because an earthquake cracked the lining 2/3 of the way down and collapsed rubble into the shaft, and the water's been sitting underneath that rubble for 6 years, patiently, waiting for literally anyone to notice it wasn't a religious problem. That's absurd, said the ledgerkeeper with the chalk beard, though with noticeably less conviction than his opening line. It's checkable, Kael said, which is more than I can say for the counting calendar theory. Get me rope, get me the strongest 3 people you've got who aren't currently trying to kill each other over jurisdiction, and get me that bucket. I'll prove it in an hour or I'll shut up forever, which I recognize as a bet you'd probably enjoy taking. There was a pause, the specific pause of a crowd deciding, collectively, whether being right was worth admitting a child had solved something 6 years of holy men hadn't. Then the old woman with the shawl snorted, once, sharply, and said, get the boy his rope. It took closer to 2 hours than 1, which Kael blamed entirely on the settlement's rope being uniformly terrible, but the shape of it went exactly as he'd expected. 3 volunteers, the chalk-bearded ledgerkeeper included, once shamed into it by the old woman, whose name turned out to be Marin and who Kael was already quietly identifying as the only adult in the entire settlement operating on pure functional competence, lowered him down on a knotted rope, because apparently nobody trusted the frayed original well rope with an actual person's weight, which told him everything he needed to know about how carefully anyone had inspected this well in 6 years. 2/3 of the way down, exactly where the damp stone had been, he found the rubble, a jagged shelf of collapsed lining, wedged tight, with the unmistakable cool breath of standing water rising through the gaps beneath it. It's here, he shouted up, voice bouncing strangely off wet stone. Rubble jam, like I said. Send down the pick. Clearing it took another 40 minutes, mostly because Kael's current body had approximately the upper body strength of a wet noodle and he had to direct Marin's grandson, a broad, quiet teenager named Dob who turned out to be the single most useful person in the entire operation, on exactly where to strike so the rest of the lining didn't come down on both their heads. 9,000 years of watching structural engineers work had given him excellent theory. It had given him absolutely no calluses. The gap between knowing exactly how to do something and having a body capable of doing it turned out to be one of the more humiliating discoveries of his current existence. But the rubble gave, eventually, with a sound like the world clearing its throat, and cold water surged up through the gap and swallowed his ankles before Dob hauled him bodily back up the rope, both of them soaked, both of them laughing in the specific unhinged way of people who'd just done something slightly insane and gotten away with it. The bucket, when they finally sent it down properly, came back up full. Kael would remember the next part for a long time, in whatever form his memory eventually took once this body wore out too, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quiet it was. 60-some people stood around a wet, dripping bucket of ordinary water and simply stared at it, the way you'd stare at something impossible, even though it was the single most explicable thing that had happened in the Fourth Cinder Basin in 6 years. Marin was the one who broke it. She dipped 2 fingers into the bucket, touched them to her tongue, and said, flatly, well, that's water, in the tone of a woman confirming a minor miracle purely because someone had to say something. Then the well made a sound. A low, groaning, satisfied gurgle, like a throat finally clearing after years of silence, and from 30 feet down, more water, a lot more water, began to rise. The cheer that went up rattled the standing stones. Kael, dripping, exhausted, 12 years old and feeling every bit of both numbers, stood at the edge of his first fixed problem in this new world and felt the satchel at his hip go warm again. Warmer than before, warm enough that he had to loosen the strap. He didn't need to look this time. He knew what it meant. Belief is currency, the light had said. You'll need worshippers before you get so much as a decent thunderclap. Well, he hadn't asked for worship. He'd just fixed a well. But watching 60 people who'd been ready to kill each other over jurisdiction an hour ago now hugging, laughing, hauling up bucket after bucket of 6 years overdue water, Kael understood, with the particular clarity of a man who'd built and lost several religions by accident, exactly what was about to happen to him whether he asked for it or not. Ress appeared at his elbow, soaked to the knees from helping haul rope, grinning so widely it looked like it might hurt. So, she said, 10% of that, I assume. Of what, exactly? The water. Of whatever that is. She jabbed a thumb at his satchel, where the glow was now bright enough to show faintly through the leather in the shade of the standing stones. You went and did a miracle, Kael. In front of witnesses. With banners. You know what happens next, right? Kael looked out at the crowd. At Marin directing traffic with the calm authority of someone who'd clearly been in charge the whole time and just hadn't been asked. At the chalk-bearded ledgerkeeper staring at his own wet hands like they belonged to someone else. At a dozen different holy symbols all momentarily, blessedly forgotten in favor of everyone just being thrilled about water, and sighed the sigh of a man who had done this exact thing before, in exactly this order, and remembered precisely how it went. They're going to build me a shrine, he said. Probably tonight, Ress agreed, entirely too pleased about it. I'm going to hate every part of that. Probably. Can I still get my 10%? Kael looked down at the satchel, at the ember glowing steady and warm through worn leather, at the first small, stupid, unavoidable step toward becoming something he had not asked to be and fully intended to be good at anyway. 10% of godhood, he said, as an extremely strange thing to negotiate before lunch. But sure, why not? Behind them, the well kept filling, and for the first time since he'd woken face down in the ash, the sky over the Fourth Cinder Basin, just at the horizon, just barely, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, flickered the palest, most tentative gray. Not rain, not yet, but something that hadn't been there yesterday.